Hi there. In this video, I put everything together we've discussed so far. In this context, if you remember, the very first thing we discussed was we went over this handout, what we'll do this semester. And we said that our main puzzle we're trying to solve is how we comprehend the text. And you have individual pieces, then you put together these pieces to solve the puzzle. The puzzle itself is how we comprehend written text. We said the important pieces are sensation, perception, attention, memory. There are some fundamental pieces we said are important to understand before we begin to talk about these things. And of those, the most important ones are language and the processing of language, where we talk about what language is and the levels of analyzing language, theories of comprehension, and the comprehension process itself at the word and sentence level. Now that we covered all the things, the next part is to put together these pieces so we can solve the problem. I'm not going to solve the problem for you, but I'm going to give you some direction. In doing so, we'll be going over several handouts, the same handouts you have seen in the final paper description. So we'll go over those handouts. Also keep in mind the weekly discussion questions are a part of helping you write a better paper. But this handout is about what we did this semester. You have to solve the puzzle by putting together all these individual pieces. This is what we have learned throughout the semester by going through these individual pieces and fundamental pieces. So if you remember, we started with understanding language. We defined language as is made of symbols and rules of combining symbols, different kinds of symbols, starting with the smallest symbol of sound, the phoneme, then morphemes, some of which are words, morphemes combined to form words, then phrases, clauses, sentences, paragraphs, and so forth. We said there are 5 levels of processing language. The first 3 are the ones that linguists study language at, and the other 2 are the ones psycholinguists study language in addition to the 3 levels. The 3 levels being phonetics, which is study of sound. Next one is syntax. The third one is lexical semantic. The last 2 are conceptual and belief level. Then we were talking about comprehension theories. If these levels of processing language talk about what happens when you read a text, right? Processing the language itself. Comprehension theories gives an explanation as to how things happen. For instance, embodied cognition talks about how when you process language, the way you comprehend it is not just propositional extraction, but it has more to it, where you become a part of the situation that is unfolded when you're reading something. And this is connected to the VSSP, if you remember, to comprehend your purpose. The purpose is for you to interact with the objects in the environment. The second set of theories we looked at was the mental models, event comprehension theories, which, like most theories, assume that we extract propositions and we store propositions when we read something. And for you to do that, you need to analyze language at these levels. Now, what mental models theory proposes is that these propositions that are extracted are put together in meaningful units. In other words, you form these bubbles or mental models so that propositions related to one event are put together and propositions related to a different event are put in different bubble, creating different mental models. Then the next theory is Kinch and Van Dyke's text comprehension theory about how we process language itself when you read. How do you group together these propositions? What Kinch's comprehension theory addressing here is the nature of the product of the comprehension. So when you process something, you form propositions and store propositions, but how are they stored in your long-term memory? What is the format of that? According to Kinch, we represent the meaning of whatever we read at 3 different levels: surface form, text-based, and situation model level at the same time. The surface form retains both the meaning. I say meaning because it incorporates the meaning also. In other words, lexical semantic processing is also involved here. But more importantly, it incorporates the syntax. Um, so the processing of the sentences at the phonetic, syntactic, and lexical semantic, all these 3 are included in the representation at the surface form level. You can think of text-based level as a subset of the surface form level. In other words, a part of it involves storing the lexical semantic aspect of it. So that is paraphrasing, that meaning, the actual propositional structure that is extracted and stored for a little longer than the surface level. Then you can think of a different set of representation where this is both a subset and a superset of the text-based representation, in the sense that if the text-based stores all the available propositions or paraphrases of the sentences you've read, situation model only selects the most important propositions from this and it gets stored at this level, the most important propositions. Another important aspect of the situation model is that it stores the inferences that you'll generate when reading a text. The inferences that you generate when you're processing language at the conceptual and belief levels. So what does it all mean? Well, when you read something, you understand it. When you understand something, you store the understanding of it in the form of a representation. That representation is at three different levels. One is the surface form, which has the representation of the exact wording and meaning. Text-based has only the representation of meaning. And the last one is the situation model, which has a representation of the most important meaningful events plus the inferences. This is lost immediately. This is lost after some time, but this is what is retained for a longer time. Okay, now the comprehension process. You can divide comprehension process into processing at the word level and clause/sentence level. Theoretically, it's a clause level, but I'm going to use clause and sentence synonymous here. What happens at the word level? That's right. You phonetically process the individual printed letters. You sense the information. For instance, when you read this, the individual printed letters are sensed, and the individual sounds of these letters are perceived, and the combination of sounds of these letters are perceived as words. Phonetic processing leads to word identification. That's what happens at the word level. What happens at the class level is the rest of these. In other words, at each word, you identify a word as a word without referring to its meaning. In these words that are identified, are stored in the short-term memory. Once you pass, all these words that are identified would go through the syntactic processing, lexical semantic processing, conceptual processing, and belief level processing. In other words, you identify the propositional structure of each of the individual words, parts of speech that word belongs to, and syntax, whether it's a subject, verb, object, and also Chomsky's the phrasal structure. Once you do that, you process the lexical semantic nature of it. What it means is that each and word, every word carry meaning. That's the dictionary meaning. That would be lexical. Each and every word also plays a semantic role, whether it's an actor, action, verb, place, things like those. That is identified as well. Then the complete meaning of the sentence put together comes when you also process the conceptual and belief levels. Conceptual level is about incorporating the the conceptual definition of the words as opposed to the lexical definition. Conceptual definition involves semantic memory. One, in the sentence, Mary and John saw mountains when they were flying to California. They refers to Mary and John, but not mountains, because mountains don't fly. But the definition of mountains doesn't say it, so it's not a part of the lexical processing. You make this inference that they belong to Mary and John because of the conceptual knowledge you have. Semantic memory one about the word mountain. You may also make an inference that they are probably in an airplane, which again is an inference that was not directly stated in the sentence. So those kind of inferences are made and incorporated in the representation at the situation model level. Then we also talked about belief level. The belief here refers to the beliefs you have as a reader about the author and the purpose of writing. Why you think is the author writing this? In a general sense, it is the context in which it is written. If it is written in the context of a detective story, it may seem or mean different. If it's written in the form of, in the context of, let's say, a fiction, that could mean something. So the context in which it's written, the genre it belongs to, may also act as a context. I want you to understand. Only when you have come to the end of the clausal level will you have representations. So, so at the word level, you're just doing phonetic processing, identifying words. But when you go to the clause level, that's when you can incorporate other. First of all, you extract and store propositions. These propositions are stored in a way that you get representations at three different levels. Then these representations are grouped according to the meaning and according to how related these propositions are. Then, along with the propositions, you also activate your sensory motor system so that you are a part of the system, so that you can interact and act. So if you see, all these theories are applicable especially to the processing at the clausal level. So we talked about the fundamental pieces. Let's talk about the basic pieces now. The basic pieces include sensation, attention, perception, and memory. And we've talked about these pieces in general, but I'm going to shift gears and pay attention to in the context of reading it, because pretty soon you're going to submit your paper by solving this puzzle. Okay, so what is sensation? Well, we said sensation. Let us use this sentence as an example. This is what we did this semester. Sensation is capturing these printed letters. As you know, our eyes capture information, especially visual information, in fixations. You fixate, and the information is captured, then you fixate, information is captured. And usually, fixations are at the levels of words. Once you get used to reading, it may become a chunk. In other words, you can read in phrases if you're a fast reader. Let's say sensation happens at each word. You capture those. Now, what comes after sensation? Attention. But given that you're reading, you're already attending to the information. So attention becomes a part of sensation. In fact, if you remember, we talked about fixation to fixation. There is a saccade, and we said what triggers saccade is this expectation called spotlight attention, which is a part of the attention. Does it make sense? So before you can capture information, you are incorporating attention in it. And I really like the way you guys actually talked about this. So you capture information. For how long is this information held in your sensory memory? In other words, in your eyes, in your retina. Well, if you remember it, you learned that, yes, it's right, 250 milliseconds. And this 250 milliseconds is what is used to perceive whatever is captured in each word. So 250 milliseconds, capture, perceive, and you identify this is a word, and this identified word is stored in your last short-term memory. Next word, 250 milliseconds, it is stored, and during this 250 milliseconds, your brain perceives it, identified as a word, and where it perceives is in the short-term memory, so it is stored in the short-term memory. So you do this cyclical process of identifying each word as a word without its meaning or anything. Then all these identified words are identified in short-term memory, and that's where the information is held. As you know, sensory memory only holds information for 250 milliseconds, but short-term memory holds information for how long? Yeah, 15 to 30 seconds. So you can read and store multiple sentences and carry on to the next set of sentences. Okay, so sensation happens at the word level. Perception also happens at the word level. Perception is identifying each word as a word in this case. Again, if you remember, if you connect this to the phonetic processing, it's related to the phonetic processing. And identifying word is key to any of these levels of representation, because without identifying words as words, you won't be able to develop propositions. You need propositions, and for that, you have to process language at other levels. So we talked about sensation, how much of the information is captured by sense organs. We talked about different experiments of Sperling's whole report, partial report. We concluded that your eyes capture 76% of the information out there. Well, this may not apply to reading because each fixation is fixated on a single word. It's like 100% of the information because your focus is so narrow that everything that is focused on is what is captured. So it's slightly different. It's like most of the information. The information that's not captured would be other sentences surrounding it because your focus is very narrow at this point. Anyways, once the information is sensed, it is perceived and identified as a word and sent to the short-term memory. Short-term memory is one of the attentional systems. Right? Okay, what is attention? We said that attention is both a mental process and a resource, and we talked about two attentional systems, system 1 and system 2, or input system or control system. Input attentional system, we looked at three basic ones: alertness, which is the mental state of being alert. Orienting reflex is the reflexive action to a sudden stimulus or a sudden change in the stimulus. Then we talked about the spotlight attention. This is the same spotlight attention that is triggering a saccade to help you move from one word to another. Then we talked about the controlled aspect of attention. This is input, which is more automatic kind of, and controlled is more conscious and controlled. And we talked about the selective / divided attentional aspect of it. Divided attention is when you're trying to be aware of more than one thing at the same time, which you cannot do. One activity always suffers. You can only shift between activities. We also talked about selective attention, where you're selectively attending to one and deselecting the other information. We talked about two important theories: early selection theory and late selection theory. The early selection theory assumes that you make the selection of what you want to attend to very early on, only after processing the physical features of it. A Broadbent's theory is one example of the early selection theories. Then we looked at late selection theory. One example we looked at was Friesman's late selection theory, where you actually process information beyond physical features till you know the meaning of what you're reading, perceiving. Then you make a decision. That's how you make a selection. We talked about early and late selection theories. Then we also talked about attention as a resource. We said attention is not only a mental process, it is also a resource. As a resource, we talked about four attentional ideas. Right? There is more in the sensory memory than you can perceive. Attentional resources are limited, and is task variability. Different tasks require different amount of attentional resources. And the last idea was that practice is key to make a difficult task easier by making them from being more resource demanding to less resource demanding. The third aspect of controlled attention was SAS, right? The same SAS that we've been referring to here when we say we identify a word in short-term memory, right? That's what SAS is. So all these identified words are identified in the short-term memory or working memory. SAS refers to both short-term and working memory. One is a simpler conception, the other one is a more complex conception. In short-term memory, we talked about how much information it can hold for how long, and how we can actually get over that. Working memory is a more complex conception of the same SAS. It's a multi-component system. It has multi-component central executive, episodic memory, and phonological loop. The phonological loop has two substructures, phonological store and the articulatory process. We talked about the processes related to each of those structures. We talked about the phenomena related to visual spatial sketchpad. We said the visual spatial sketchpad is embodied in the sense that we process information in real time with the purpose to react and interact. And we looked at visual spatial sketchpad related phenomena like mental rotation, representational momentum, boundary effect. Then we also talked about the episodic buffer, which said that the latest component that was added by Badley and H to their original three structure model. And then we said episodic memory integrates information from multiple components from working memory and gives you the complete experience of an event by putting together the sound, voice, picture, and everything else you're experiencing at any given point of time. So that's about what we did this semester. And there's a lot we did this semester. I'm going to just give you a bigger picture. Now, the last piece was memory. When we say short-term memory, but short-term memory is more than memory, right? That's why we put that in that attention. So memory specifically, we are referring to long-term memory. Long-term memory is both a mental process and a storage system. So is long-term memory. We also talked about the classification of long-term memory, if you remember, declarative long-term memory and non-declarative long-term memory. And the non-declarative is the memory for how. The declarative memory is about memory for what. Based on the content is further divided into episodic memory and semantic memory. Episodic memories are memories for personal experiences. Semantic memories are memories for general knowledge. And the general knowledge that you generate is based on your experiences over time. The general knowledge you have gained is not coming from one sitting, one reading, one episode. It's coming from multiple experiences related to objects or ideas that you extract, then that becomes a part of your semantic memory, one conceptual knowledge, or about situations that you experience, then you have concepts for situations, then that becomes a part of your semantic memory too. Situational knowledge. Both are a set of complex network of concepts. If the concepts are about objects and ideas, it's semantic memory one. If these concepts are about situations, then it's semantic memory two. And we also talk about schemas, scripts, and concept activation. The process involving is concept activation, spread of activation, search intersection. These things apply to both semantic memory 1 and 2. Well, I hope this quick review helped you. And I'll go over the other three handouts. Okay, so in this next two slides, what we will try to do is talk about the comprehension processes in a little bit more detail. First, we'll talk about the processes at the word level and then at the class level. So what happens at the word level? Well, you already know that, right? First, it goes through a mental process of number one. What is it? Captures printed letters, sensation. So you capture the printed letters, that's sensation. Then second part is you identify the printed letters and their sounds, perception of letters. The third thing we do is perception of the combination of the individual letters and their sounds as word. So that's exactly what happens at the word level. And what happens at the class level are the remaining things, like the other processes, the syntactic, lexical, semantic, conceptual, and belief level processing. So we'll talk more about the sentence level in the next slide. So at the class level, we process language at the remaining four levels of Miller's four levels of processing language, which include the syntactic processing, lexical semantic processing, conceptual processing, and belief level processing. As a result of this processing, we extract and create propositions. We have theories about how we might do it. So how do we extract propositions from the text? We said we list all relations, then we create propositions from these relations. Remember, relations are the verbs and adjectives in a sentence. For a sentence like the genius Thomas Alva Edison discovered electric bulb, we would take discovered, genius, electric as relations. You list all the relations, then you create propositions for each relation. So you would say Thomas Alva Edison was genius was one proposition. The bulb was electric was another one. Edison discovered bulb is another. So you have three propositions. Then you combine these three propositions to form a complex proposition. That is how you store the extracted meaning. This is from one sentence. When you read several such things, you have a network of propositions that you have extracted. Now, different theories about how or what you might do with these propositions. These theories include embodied cognition, mental models, and Kinch's text comprehension theory. According to embodied cognition, it's not just the propositions that you extract and represent, but you also activate and simulate the somatosensory and motor areas for the purpose of interacting with the environment. Mental models proposes that these propositions are grouped together based on how related these propositions are in terms of their content, all related to one event, one time, one character, are put together to form one mental model and so forth. Kinshas theory talks about what the product is of comprehension. Well, when you comprehend a sentence or eventually the paragraph, there are three levels of representation at each time you develop the surface form level, text-based level, and situation model layer. What happens as a result is that you store these representations in your long-term memory, and it becomes a part of both episodic and semantic long-term memory. This is something you need to keep in mind because they both have the same propositional structure. Again, I thought it would be helpful to go over all the handouts that were posted in the final paper section. One of the handouts that were posted emphasizes the 5 levels of processing. The next slide talks about how this would be related to the 3 levels of representing knowledge. As you can see, the first level is the phonetic processing, which is processing language at the sound level, which leads to, as we have seen, word identification. Once all the words are identified, you have other processes kicking in. The first one is syntactic processing, which leads to creating a phrasal structure, subject, verb, object, nature of the words, and also the parts of speech the verb plays in a given sentence. This syntactic structure will give clues to the lexical and semantic aspects of each word. Remember, all these things are happening at the clause level. Lexical semantic leads to knowing the word's lexical meaning. Semantic processing leads to understanding or activating the word's semantic case role. The thematic case role or the case roles, the actor, action, recipient, location, and time. These three are the linguistic levels of analyzing language. The other two are the additional levels that psycholinguists study yet. So these are the psycholinguistic levels, which includes conceptual and belief level. And we also talk about how conceptual level processing leads to generating inferences related to conceptual knowledge. So these inferences are from the conceptual knowledge. The belief level leads to also generating inferences based on the context in which you're reading a text, including the beliefs you have about the writer. In this slide, we'll talk about how Miller's 5 levels of analyzing language are related to Kinch's 3 levels of representing meaning. If you can see, I tried to give you a color-coded clue. I don't know if you were able to actually identify that. You can see these are red color and the surface level is coded red, and the second one is the text base, it's coded in green. The lexical semantic is coded in green, and the situation model is coded blue. And you can see these are the conceptual and belief levels that are coded in blue, giving some clues about how this might be related. At surface level, as you know, it incorporates the syntactic structure and meaning. So it's not exactly just red, but red is unique to it. It identifies words and has a syntactic structure. Surface level also has lexical and semantic aspect to it. So surface level has both phonetic information, syntactic information, and lexical semantic. Express level is mostly related to lexical semantic because it has just a meaning, not the exact word. And then the situation model has some of the lexical semantic. The most important events are stored as their positions. Most importantly, the conceptual and belief levels are the important part. So it's not just blue inferences, but some parts of green also there. These are the handouts I wanted to review, which I thought would help you with your paper. Please shoot me an email if you need help. As I said, I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much. Have fun learning.